I'm Adam Moz, and this is Moz Models. It's a rainy Sunday morning today, so unfortunately we can't complete the setup on the Maule itself because I do have to get outside. I have some rather cramped space, and I can't do a surface setup on my desk. I just don't have the space to do it on a 1.5 meter model. That's going to have to wait till I can get to the field, which will hopefully happen sometime this week. But in the meantime, we've got a couple of little things that we're going to go through, and I'm just going to talk at the end a little bit about a couple of menus on Spektrum, what they do, and what the notional equivalent is on ETHOS. These are the channel assign menus and the RX port assignment menus. These two menus drive me nuts on Spektrum. I'll get into that later. First thing we're going to do is on ETHOS, we're going to change our display here, specifically the timer 2 and timer 3 slots, to show us some telemetry. On Spektrum, telemetry is on, you won't see it show up right now because I don't have a receiver bound. However, if you did have a receiver bound, or sorry, I don't have a receiver connected right now. So if I did have one, you would get telemetry on those two on an additional page. If you hold on for a second, I will just go and dig out the receiver for this aircraft, one I pulled out, and we are back. Okay, so now with the receiver actually linked, you can see we've got a flight log page, we've got a base min-max page. Right now it's giving nothing for RPM. It's not going to give anything for RPM because this receiver doesn't send any RPM data unless it's paired with a smart ESC. You see the minimum receiver voltage and you see the maximum. And I've got this plugged into a 2S Lifey battery right now because it's sitting on my desk. So 2.7, that's where the receiver powered up. That is not the actual minimum, unfortunately. It's a transient, and you can see more RPM telemetry, AS3X settings, safe limits, and gyroscope data, G-force data. So this is actually pretty cool. It's nice that it gives you the settings out there. You can get all of that from FreeSky receiver. It's just presented a little bit differently. So actually let's just go and show how that's presented on the FreeSky receiver. So you go to model, page over, telemetry, and here you've got the basic sensors. So you got receiver battery, acceleration X, which is your X, some of your the ACC sensors are your acceleration in each three axes. Then we've got VFR, that's valid frame rate. That is the percentage of the last full block of 100 frames that was received in valid form. Valid is the data is usable. So if there's either it didn't hear a frame or it got a corrupted frame, it would be down from 1. The reason for 100 blocks of 100 makes the math super easy. If you get 70 frames in that block of 100 that are good, you have a 70% VFR. ADC2, that is the analog voltage input, aka AN2. RSSI is your receiver's signal strength indicator. RX indicates which of the 3 RX slots is currently sending telemetry. That is, if you're running a multi-receiver setup, telemetry can fail over. Your external sensors will fail over. The receiver sensors themselves do not fail over. So if you've got a serial receiver and a stabilized receiver, all the stabilization sensors from the stabilized receiver only will show up when that's the receiver sending telemetry. So if it fails over to the serial receiver that's plugged in for redundancy, you'll lose all of your ability to configure or record the stabilization telemetry. The stabilization will still work, just the telemetry that doesn't, and the configuration that's pages that are tied to the telemetry. That's a gotcha. On Spektrum, they only ever send telemetry from one receiver. It's whichever receiver has the best telemetry send capability. So if you put a, say, an AR46 or a SPM 4651T with that 631, this 4651T will be the one sending telemetry. And it will send all the telemetry it has. You can move down here. Here we've got the rest of the accelerators, and then we've got the roll and pitch angle. This doesn't do yaw angle, but that's equivalent to, I'll just go over here. So on Spektrum it sends roll, pitch, and yaw. That's one difference. The FreeSky ones only send roll and pitch. They don't send yaw because they don't have good data for that. The accelerants are the equivalent of your G-force meters. That's your acceleration in each 3-axis, and that will send yaw on FreeSky. The last thing on here, where you see the little red 3 dashes, that's where the actual value would be. Note, in FreeSky, some of these sensors actually send more data than just what's displayed here. That's the primary value for the channel. Good example is a LiPo sensor. It'll show up as one slot here, but you can actually get all of your LiPo data out of it. We will show that in a later video when we're ready to fly, because I'm going to put an FVLS ADV 8S LiPo sensor into the Maule before we fly it. That will be in a later video. It's very simple to set up. Run one servo cable back to the receiver, configure a port on the receiver for telemetry, and then you plug the sensor in, plug it into the balance port on the battery, and we get some really cool data there. Now, what we're going to go do, however, is something we can't do on Spektrum, which is, okay, let's go back. I forgot. I keep forgetting the return button doesn't return you to the main screen on Spektrum. It does, and it doesn't do the same thing on FreeSky as well when we're paging through the screens. Right now we only have one screen. If we set up a second screen, we can page between them, but we'll get into that a little later. So what I'm going to do is first off, I'm going to take the timer 2 and configure the widget. And now this is a value widget by default. And what we want is a value widget. We just want, instead of a timer, we want to use telemetry. So you go over here, category becomes telemetry, and then we can pick any of ours, and I'm just going to pick RxBat for now. When we change this up in the future, we're going to use LiPo there instead, because RxBat is not really useful for telling you you've got anything other than a screaming problem when you've got a beck. If your RxBat changes when you have a beck, you've probably already noticed because the plane crashed. And we'll go down timer 3. I'll edit that one. Oh, whoops, I just went to the timer edit. You can actually directly edit the timers from here. But we want to go configure widget. And we're going to go here, and we're going to pick telemetry again. And I'm going to pick VFR. Now, I'm a huge fan of the VFR as a measure of signal strength, because it tells me how good the data I'm getting. It's the same thing on Spektrum in your flight log. Ignore the dBm, that's RSSI, unless you're trying to figure out where the edge of your range where the signal is getting low is. What you care about are your fades, your holds, and this actually gives your RxBat there. So this is the equivalent of what we've got here. You've got your timer, you've got your fades, your holds, and your receiver battery. We've got the same thing set up here, except we also have the picture. I will do another video. That'll be a tech tip on pictures on both, because it's not well known, but you can put an actual aircraft picture on an NX radio. It was a feature introduced, I think, in 3.07. And it's not the world's greatest picture, because this is a low-res screen with an interesting color approach. But it does take a BMP. It has to be 565 format without a conversion table. So you want to do it up in something like Paint. Don't do it in Photoshop unless you're really good at setting up the BMP output parameters in Photoshop, because you can easily create a BMP image that the NX radio can't display. On Ethos, you've got JPEG, you've got PNG, and you've got BMP formats. It is also picky about the BMP format, but the nice thing is you can put an 800 by 480 BMP and it'll display. The JPEG and the PNG have to be the right size for the specific screen type. That's 180 by 166 for the X18s and the X-Lites. It's larger. I don't remember what the number is offhand for the X20 and the XE, and I do believe the Horus radios use the same size as the X18. Their screens are just a touch smaller in terms of resolution. So here we go. We have our telemetry on screen, and we have our telemetry on screen. I'm just going to show how you add a screen in FreeSky. You hit the little plus, the pages button, and and then you go up here and you add a screen. You hit plus there to add a screen, and you can pick the layout of the screen. And that even allows full screen. If you've got a widget like the Zavionics widgets, you can go full screen, you assign that one full screen widget to it, and then you get whatever it displays. And then there's a couple here where you've got some trim displays. The default is this one with the big square on the left and the 3 lines on the right. And there's a 2 big square one for 2 widgets if you want to have your trims. The little lines in here, you can just barely see. That's your trim display. So you'll see all the trim axes displayed there, plus your widgets. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pick a relatively simple, a 9 square. And then you can go in here and you can configure your widgets. So change this. And you can put a model bitmap there, a value, timer logs, GPS map. Yes, you can preload GPS maps onto here, and then it'll display your position on a map based on the GPS data it gets. LiPo is the LiPo sensor for the FVLS, FVLSS, and MVLSS sensors, or anything else that sends LiPo format. Channels, that's a interesting gotcha. It doesn't send channels, it sends output channels. So if you want to see what you're sending to the RF, you pick your channels widget. On a small widget like this, it'll show 4 channels. On a larger format widget, it can show more. Then there's line chart, which shows line chart based on a value. One got you there. It will continue ticking through and displaying the same consistent value if you lose telemetry. So don't rely on the line chart to go looking for loss of VFR, loss of RSSI, because when the receiver disconnects, you're not going to see it in the line chart. You want to use something that evaluates your logs. 1.5.0 introduces a log viewer with graphing that is absolutely excellent. You want to wait for that. And then I've got some Lua ones in here. I've got the FLVSS Lua, a Gauge Lua, an RSSI Lua, and I'm not even sure what sinus is. I've never played with it. So I'm going to do that Lua RSSI. So I've just exited out there, and you can see I come down here, I click, and there. No, clicking return doesn't do anything, but clicking this middle button here pages through, or you can just swipe. It's the equivalent of using the roller. Roller on this does let you roll through, but it goes not by page, but by widget. Next up, we've got a couple of special functions to set up because we haven't done anything around stabilization. So we'll start off on the Spektrum one. Go back here. And let's go down to audio events and switch changes. We're going to new sound event. Click here. Oh, I got to go there. Switch one. That's switch I here. So position 1, which is the current one, is going to be normal mode. Position 2. And now let's go looking. We want a panic or emergency or something like that. Because this is our safe on. We put it on a button, so it's really only for emergency. So we'll go through here. There's a lot of switch. There's a lot of callouts in here, some of which I really, really wonder about. Why do I need to say something switch I? Actually, I can tell you about that. It's some Spektrum radios have touch sensitive switches, so you can touch them and they tell you what, and you can have them tell you what they do. The other thing is for spoken checklists, which is a cool feature of Spektrum, you have everything preloaded in here and they let you access all the system callouts. Something that Ethos does not. The system callouts only can be called by a value. If you want to use any of them as a regular callout that you set up, you need to copy the file over to your /audio folder. And let's keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay. There are a lot of callouts in here. One reason why the lack of custom audio is a little bit less of an issue than you would think that it is. And there we go, we have panic. Now I do something a little bit silly. I don't have a panic audio callout on my Ethos sound pack. I'm just going to set this one to the side a little bit so I can get at them. Because I have to access the switches here. So we're going to go in here, we're going to go play track enabled and switch position up. So what I do is I have I admit this is kind of silly, but I have an audio callout that says
Pink monkey.
I think it's funny, so I do it. And we're going to clone this one, edit.
Pink monkey, pink monkey, pink monkey, pink monkey.
Okay.
Pink monkey, stabilization off.
And they're saying that it's disabled. Okay, now let's go create another one. And I tend to, when I'm doing a set, I tend to create a new one for the set and then just iterate through. So we're going to pick SB up, and this is our stabilization modes because we have 3 stabilization modes on the Ethos setup with the Archer Plus. We only have right now AS3X on, which is always on, and then a self level on here, which is why I did not set it on a switch, unlike what I'm doing here. Just a little bit different in setup. Once I get the rate stabilization dialed in on the Maule, I'm going to actually set this up so it's permanently in rate stabilization mode, and I only get self level when I pull the emergency. So let's go back in here. And this is up, so we want stabilization off. And we want to clone it, edit. Now we're going to go to the middle one, and we're going to go see if I've got a rate stabilization call out. I'm pretty sure. So now we're just going through and just seeing what I have in terms of call outs here. Oh, I remember what I do here. I just put stabilization on, and then I've got a clone here.
Stabilization on.
And then we're going to go up, and I have a self level. So you've got
Stabilization off. Stabilization on. Self-level mode.
there we go. So that's those callouts set up. Now I want to talk about one of the things that really drives me nuts about all of Airware. And that is the channel assign menu. And we're going to get into a little bit of mixing theory. I'm just going to go in there. I got to go RF disabled, scroll down to channel assign. So this channel input configuration is what it says when you go into channel assign. This is not inputting anything into channels. Spektrum has function slots, and each function slot is either assigned to one of the functions tied to your wing and flaps setup. So that is in air mode, what's configured in terms of your wing and tail type and flap system. And in sailplane mode, it's still wing and tail type to occupy the slots, but you configure everything in camber preset and camber system. And then you get, and I'm just going to click so that gets bright again. And the remaining ones, you have your AUX functions. Gear, it's a legacy name, it's AUX 0. So you start at AUX 0, or gear, at channel 5. Channel 6 is AUX 1. You'll see it's NA here because I have a flap function assigned, so that flap slot has been taken. Anytime you see NA, that means that a wing and tail type configuration has taken your function slot over. And then what you've got is you've got switch A is assigning, this is a function input config, not a channel input config, because I'll go and show you a little bit later what that is. So here we can go in, if we want switch D on channel 5, there it is. Or we can go and we can put that back, switch C, oh, there we go, switch A. We'll leave it at switch A. These are pre-populated in Spektrum. It's very different in FreeSky. Nothing is pre-populated because this is the equivalent of adding a free mix and assigning an input to that free mix. Note I didn't say anything about outputs. This page does the same thing as when you add a free mix, and we'll add a free mix, this position, go in there, and setting your source. It does not, I repeat, not do anything to the output channel assignment here. Now, the caveat there is Spektrum pre-assigned stuff. You'll notice that we assigned channel 8 AUX 3 to I. That's by default your analog knob here. Outside of that, let's put that back to A. AUX 2 is B, and AUX 3 is I. So then when you go over to the next page, our export assignments. This doesn't do our export assignments. This does channel, function to channel mapping. Takes your function, which is on the right, and maps it to the channel on the left. This is what you send. It has nothing to do technically with what comes out of the port on the receiver. It's what channel you're sending over RF. So, misleading menu again. This one is the equivalent if we go down here and we set our output, it's the same. So our output here is channels. These are channels. A little bit reversed. This one goes function or mix to output. On Spektrum, it's just straight up output to mix, or to function, I'm sorry. Mixing does something a little different on Spektrum than it does on FreeSky. The end result is mostly the same, but you do have to be cognizant of it because Spektrum, the function, and the mixing are separate. A function may do mixing. All of the surface functions do it. All of the OGs are just a straight one-to-one mapping, input to output, no processing. On FreeSky, everything may do mixing. You can have multiple mixes to one channel, and then it just sums up the output at the end, depending on the mixer function settings. It's a lot more complex, but for baby steps, treat a function, an OGS function on Spektrum, the equivalent, no, we don't want to do that, the equivalent to a bare, unconfigured free mix where you've only set the source and the output. They're functionally the same. The other ones here, the wing and tail type, those work like the so-called canned mixes, or as I've started to call them, the functional mixes on FreeSky. If we go back here, that is our aileron, elevator, throttle, rudder, flaps as well. These are mixes that do something specific, and they really work like functions on Spektrum. They have a specific way they work. Typically, they're hard-coded to particular inputs. Throttle is an exception for both. And they do their thing, the output to a channel, as is mapped here. You can go in both cases and remap to other channels. There's some gotchas with Spektrum. I really recommend, if you've got a throttle channel, leave it on channel 1. This is not anything to do with the radios. This is Spektrum receivers, depending on the one you want, or the one you're using, either have a preset failsafe, so a failsafe that goes to a specific position only on channel 1 for some of them. So you want your throttle to go to minimum, you have to have it on channel 1. The rest of these, the rest of the ports just stop sending any data. Functionally, they go to mid. That's a lot of the older Spektrum non-telemetry low-end receivers have this. Some of the higher-end ones tend to have the option of preset failsafe on all channels. The newer ones have preset failsafe on all channels. The other key piece, smart ESCs have to plug into channel 1. They cannot plug into any other channel, or they will work like dumb ESCs. So you really want to keep your throttle on channel 1. On FreeSky, if you're using an S-series receiver, any receiver with S in the model name, i.e. a stabilized one, so that's your S6R, S8R, the Archer and Archer Plus SRs, the R9 Stab, or the RBs with stabilization, so the 30, 30 Plus, 40, 25S, and 35S, and the new TD SR18. You have to use AETR mapping on those, so your throttle has to be on channel 3. This is a limitation of the stabilization system. If you turn that off, you don't have that limit. So I tend to run my throttle on channel 3 regardless, but you can actually have your throttle on any real channel you want. Outside of the stabilization system, there's no limitations in FreeSky on where you put your throttle or what your failsafe configuration is. But getting back to here, there is a way on a handful of Spektrum receivers to actually map ports at the receiver. It uses a Spektrum Programmer app. It works on the AR636, the AR7350, and the AR9350. These are all discontinued receivers, but the 636s are everywhere if you want them. All three of these receivers have, port 1 is always mapped to throttle channel 1. You can map throttle to other channels as well. The other channels can be mapped on any channel up to 9 or 10, depending on the specific receiver. I believe the 9350 can map up to 10. The rest of them, the 636 I know is limited to 9. I'm not sure about the 7350. I've never actually played with one. On FreeSky, what you do is you can map any channel to any port on access tandem and twin receivers. The older ACCST D16 receivers, the X series, or the S6R and S8R. Actually, you can't do this on the S6R and S8R because of the stabilization setup. They have to be always with the same setup because they need channels 9 to 12 for stabilization. But the X, any receiver with X in the name, can be mapped to either high or low channels. That means that the PWM ports are either in the 1 to 8 range or the 9 to 16 range. So you can take two receivers, put them in, say if you got two 8 channels, an Archer R10 Plus in ACCST mode, an X8R, an RX8R Pro. You can have one of them, which is your low channels, 1 to 8, and the second one put in, and then you get 9 to 16. You don't need anything fancy. You need two relatively inexpensive receivers for 16 channels. On Axis and later, you have a lot more flexibility. You go into the set, you pick options, and it's not going to do anything here because it needs to talk to the receiver to do so. Receiver's in the airplane and it's powered off right now. And it comes back no response from receiver. But in there, you can pick each port. And on the Axis, the regular Axis receivers, this is the RX series receivers running Axis firmware, or an Archer, as well as the TD-SR6, the TD-MX, the TWMX, and the first TW-R6 and GR6. You can map any channel to any port on them. On the Archer Plus receivers, the TDR10, the TDR18, and I believe the new, I believe there's an update coming for the TWR6 and the TWGR6. It's new hardware. I don't believe it's a firmware update. You can map those ports also to FBus, to SBus, and to S-port. So you can plug anything into anything, configure it. The only caveat is if it supports SBus in for redundancy, that has to be in port 1. So the TDR10, TDR18, the Archer Plus R10 and Archer Plus SR10, all your redundant receiver plugs into port 1 when you're running in redundancy mode. And yes, that does mean that the Archer Plus receivers right now, the R10 Plus, the SR10 Plus, don't do redundancy in ACCST mode. Because ACCST mode, they're fixed. They have ports 1 to 8 or channels 1 to 8, or depending on whether or not they bind low or high. And then you have SBus out and S-port on the two lower on ports 9 and 10. That's fixed in firmware. There may be a firmware out in the future that changes that up and drops one of the PWM ports for redundancy, or possibly the one of the other two ports. We'll see when that comes. There's no commitment on that. It's just been talked about at this point. So, in summary, the RX port assignments on Spektrum is your channel assignments, not your RX port assignments. And let's go back down to previous. Channel input config is your function input config. Assigns inputs to functions for auxiliary functions only. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit is about mixing. So go back here. Now, what mixing does on the two radios is sort of the same and sort of different. Because the aux functions are treated like inputs and outputs to mixes, so are the other functions, rather than mixes themselves, even though the wing type mixers do mixing. So you can map, when you create a mix, you got a few canned mixes here, and they depend on the model type. The canned mixers are very definitely different for airplane mode and sailplane mode and heli mode. So right now you've got a rudder to aileron or elevator, you've got an aileron to rudder, and you've got an elevator to flap. This is, again, the first one is really a knife edge type mix. You can also do, if you like to fly, if you want to try flying mode 1 a little, or you like to fly your rudder stick and get a little bit more roll, You can use that. Aileron under rudder is your classic. You want to mix in a coordinated turn. You'll never actually pull that off, by the way, because it's only ever going to be right for one turn at one speed. But it can allow you to take a rudder-happy aircraft, like say a Cub, and fly it right stick only, like you would fly a a Timber or a Chaos or something that is much happier flying yank and bank if you don't want to fly rudder, if you're not fully comfortable flying your fourth axis. Elevator to flap, that's snap flaps. This is something that can make your loop or your square loops a little bit more square, your turns in a pylon race a little tighter. If you're running a flapper on wing type and use the elevator to flap mix, essentially what it does is you are using the flaps to adjust the lift amount on your wing to balance the changes on the elevator so the aircraft rotates even quicker. When you pull up elevator, your flaps drop down to give more lift on the wing and the aircraft rotates upwards quicker. When you pull down elevator, your flaps reflex and reducing the lift on the wing, allowing the aircraft to rotate down quicker. And then you've got regular mixes. And there's 10 mixes on the NX8, which is nice. The NXs are more powerful than the older DXs, so they threw some love to us and added some mixes. Now there's two kinds of mixes, normal and curve. Normal is your straight up linear mix. You've got a rate, that's it. Curve allows you to curve the mix, so you add a curve, and that will mean that it can adjust over time. It can be a non-linear mix. I'll just go into normal now. You've got rate up and rate down. You've got an offset, which essentially moves the center point up and down. And yes, and you can't select curve in this case. Switch allows you to, is equivalent to active condition, allows you to turn it on and off, except you can only do it with a switch or an analog switch position. No ability to do it from, say, a logical switch. If this was a higher end radio, you'd have combo switches where the combo of two positions can be rated there. But the first thing there, that's your input, and you've got all your functions and then all your inputs. And yes, actually, technically, you can actually use the roller as a mix input, believe it or not. So I'm going to set that back to inhibit, and then let's say throttle, and then your output, however, can only be a function. That's kind of similar. If you view the channels or the channel outputs in the mixer on FreeSky as the equivalent of a function, and you're laying a mix on top of it, then it works pretty much the same thing. The difference is that you've got much more flexibility on FreeSky as what your input is. A source can be anything that generates an analog, plus the absolutely beautiful min, max, and zero sources, so you can send an arbitrary value to a channel easily. On NX, you have to assign a switch, and then you have to go into digital switch setup to send an arbitrary value. On FreeSky, you can just send an arbitrary value, either min, max, or zero, which is, min is minus 100, max is 100, 0 is 0, or you can set up a var mix, and in 1.50, just a var function to send any arbitrary valid value to your mixer. And as we showed off earlier, there's a little bit more configurability here. You got source, you got function type here, which says what it does: add, multiply, replace, and lock. So what add does is adds. You can have more than one mix going to one channel. If this one's types to add, it adds the value to the value of the mixers above it in the stack for that channel. Multiply multiplies the mixers above it, the value of the mixers above it, by its value. That could be kind of nifty if combined with a curve for certain really, really oddball uses. What replace does is it replaces all the mixes above with its value, and it can still be added to. Lock is a lockout. It just, when it's active, it's hard coded to this value output of this mixer. Nothing else can influence it. If you want to do a custom throttle cut or throttle hold or any sort of force something to a specific position and don't let it change, use a lock mixer. Do remember to make sure that your active condition is selectable, because with a lock mixer there, that mixer stack won't do anything else. And if you're wondering what I mean by mixer stack, I can go add another mix, free mix, last position, and we'll go put this on channel 6 as well. So you can see we've got two mixers outputting on the same channel. What do they do? Depending on the function, as we just went through, there's 4 different function types. With an add, they sum up the values of every mixer outputting to that channel and output it. So you can go and you can build a mixer that, for example, is your nose wheel trim. Have it output to your nose wheel channel, assign T5 or T6 to it, and you've got an independent trim. You can use this to do things like adjustable, you can have an adjustable offset on your flaps for your camber control. That's what a camber mix is, by the way. That's a function, a pre-canned function that does exactly that. When you get into sailplane programming, you can get very, very deep into this and have some really complex mixes as you do full span, full house sailplane mixing, where you've got camber and reflex, you've got snap flaps, you've got full span ailerons, you've got, and you may have crow, and they are all interacting on that wing at the same time, depending on your flight modes. You can even have things like live adjustment of certain values. It gets very complex very quick. Now I'm just going to go here and delete these mixes. So scroll down, delete is kind of hidden. Be careful, delete is next to clone. You can accidentally trigger a mix, and then yes, we want to reset channel 6. So now we're back to what we had before. But that's it. Mixing is significantly more complex in Ethos, but you don't have to get into the complexity. You can just go and do it. If you don't want complexity, you don't have to. If you do want the complexity, the option is there. You cannot get anywhere near as complex in mixing in Spektrum because you are so tied on what capability the mix could do. It's really just, you've got rates, curves, and offset. That's it. You have no equivalent of replace, multiply, or lock type functions on the mix. Although you can functionally do a lock if you mix around -100, the same channel to itself at -100 weight. That'll be very similar to a lock. Or sorry, I should say the same function to itself. The reality is, most of your applications this is going to be fine for. When you get into something interesting, particularly advanced programming, Ethos just walks away. It's far, far more capable, like OpenTX, in your ability to do complex mixing in a straightforward manner. That said, with Ethos, you don't have to do the complexity. Don't be scared of the complexity. Learn it when you need it. If you don't need it, don't worry about it. It's something you can just leave turned off. That's actually true for all radios except to some extent OpenTX and EdgeTX. If you don't need the complexity, ignore it. It's not relevant to your needs, so you don't need to know it. Make the radio a lot easier to work with. If the stuff you don't understand and you don't need, you don't pay attention to. Learn it when you need it. It's the extra capability that's in the bag when you buy that fancy model. Okay, so that's it for today. This one's gone definitely a little bit longer, but we were talking about mixing, and mixing gets complex fast. So we'll go back out and go back out. And here we go. You've got your default pages. As you can see, there is,
Flaps half.
I'm just going to pop this in there. You do have your flight mode labels there and there. Your timer, which is there and there. Your trims, get 4 of them here. Note that it does not display for these 2 top trimmers, while in this case T5 and T6 are displayed in the middle here. I generally find T5 and T6 as implemented on Ethos is just much more capable than the relatively limited implementation on Spektrum. These do enough, these do way more. And that's it for today. So next time, hopefully we'll get out, we'll get the Maule configured, and maybe we'll even get a maiden. Thank you, and be sure to like and subscribe to my channel.